So let's just take a minute to review from the last video. When he first returned, Sean made a video where he said that there were certain limitations put on science, that it had certain qualitative data that could not be shown through pure naturalistic observation. His example was his purple painting here. And he said that if I didn't have the genetic material on the painting, and I didn't have his signature, there would be no way to determine its authorship. I responded to this by saying that his signature and his DNA wouldn't be needed in order to determine authorship. If we had enough quantifiable data, then we'd know it already. In fact, we could know potentially more than even Sean knows about the painting, such as where the inks came from, how the pigment is created, that sort of thing. Now, I gave also the example of Jackson Pollock, who has a distinctive mathematical property in all of his paintings, which is extremely difficult to reproduce. So if we find paintings that look like Pollock but don't have the signature and don't have DNA, we would still be able to determine through a quantifiable analysis. This is where theologica37 steps in. He says that actually what Venom Fang X was trying to do was to give us an analogy to the world, that the painting is like the world and that the painter is like God. And a purely scientific worldview is not going to show us that God designed the world, what his purpose was, and what his intention was. He also argues that my analogy is a false one because there's no other world to compare to. This leaves me in a bit of a bind, because although I think Theologica's argument is false, it has that nice upswing of being completely devastating to the argument for God's existence from the inference of design, and that's something I'm genuinely in favor of. But I do think we can actually draw inferences of design, because we have other designed objects that we can analogize to. We take these designed objects and see that there are certain principles and functions with which they all operate. And then we can ask ourselves, from any object that we find, does it fulfill some sort of purpose? Are there some sort of principles at work that we could investigate? Now, this is completely in line with the work that scientists do all the time in the field of biology. They constantly look at certain principles through which evolutionary science takes and draw their inferences there. So, to sort of conclude, I would say that two things have not actually been demonstrated. First of all, Sean has not demonstrated that authorship cannot be shown through quantifiable analysis. Authorship, I've shown, is actually completely unnecessary for it, that the fractals in Pollock's painting work about as well as any signature ever could. Secondly, Theologica has not shown that my analogy is a false one, simply on the basis that there is no other world to compare to. I've shown that there's actually no use for another world. We can draw the sorts of analogies that Sean wanted to do about purpose from other things that have purpose. We don't need another world to analogize through. But there's other properties that both of them actually listed as being qualitative properties, things that I haven't talked about yet, but I'll talk about them now. The things that they've also mentioned were things like meaning and purpose. Now, purpose is a bit different than design. Design can actually show you if there was some sort of intent around it, or if there was some sort of tinkering taking place. Even Richard Dawkins uses the word design to talk about evolved systems. What I want to do is actually show you exactly where the mistake both Theologica and VFX make. They make it right before our eyes, and might be a little bit faster than any of us actually noticed. In fact, it took me a couple of viewings before I saw it take place right before my eyes. So I'm going to play both clips for you right now, and try to detect now exactly where their mistake happens.
You couldn't have figured that out using the scientific method. There is no way that this painting itself contains that information that I just relayed to you. That's a quality that this has, that's in the mind of its creator, and not found using the scientific method in the paper, although the paper and the painting somehow contains the image, or the, I'm not quite sure what the language would be, but my intention has been translated onto this page, and it continues to contain that quality such that I can say, my purpose is achieved in this.
Consider an intricate painting. The painting was painted to convey a message, was painted with a specific intent and motive, and has specific qualities directly attributable to the mind of the painter. Further, upon materialistic, quantitative, property-esque analysis of the painting, none of the former qualitative characteristics can even possibly be found.
Were you able to spot the mistake that's being made? Actually, on multiple viewings of this, I think that Sean realizes his error actually in the process of making it. Because he says that the purpose and meaning known only to the creator is not, and he stops himself, as available to science. Why then, if both Theologica and VFX think that the intentions and purpose are in the mind of the creator, that they've limited their test for science to being about the painting? That to me seems to be a bit of a false test, because you don't actually think that property and meanings are like chemical valencies. They didn't attach to the painting at some sort of point. So of course they're not available to science, but it's not available to anyone else, because what you've done actually is to give a standard of proof that is literally impossible to meet. The meaning and purpose is in the mind of the creator and not in the painting. So why then you stopped your analysis and said you have only the painting to derive from? That's impossible. No one can do that. So that's not a particularly bad failing on science's part. But we would say that science does have the ability to actually investigate your beliefs and your utterances. These are what we'd call the social, behavioral, and cognitive sciences, because they actually do investigate the utterances of people, their behaviors, their beliefs, and if purpose and meaning are anywhere, even according to their own examples, they're certainly in the mind of the creator. So not only is it a bad choice, it also assumes that science is limited to chemistry and physics, which it isn't. This, I'm sorry, is a really bad mistake, and I'm struggling not to laugh. Because if we're going to talk about bad analogies at all, first of all, it is a bad analogy because you've set this bar far too high to something no one thinks. And second of all, even if it were knowable by anyone, it would be knowable in a far more thorough way to other scientists, to behavioral, to cognitive scientists. So again, they've badly mischaracterized the work that science actually does and takes place. And they knew it. They knew it the entire time because they started their discussion by admitting it. So, in conclusion, I would say that, at very least, my rebuttals still stand, because I don't think there's been anything said by Theologica that contradicts any of it. It doesn't show us that there are limits on science. It shows us that there would be limits on knowledge if we only focused ourselves strictly on the painting. But I'd also be very quick to point out that this thought experiment could easily fall into very wacky, ridiculous waters, depending on how we interpret Sean's use of the phrase, only the painting. Because Theologica says, if we only had that painting and no other articles of Sean's work, we wouldn't be able to define whether it was Sean. But we could also take that into a slightly wackier land and say, if you didn't have any paintings at all, you wouldn't know it was a painting to begin with. Fortunately, we don't live in such a world, and as such, I don't think Theologica's points stand at all.